Okay, I think we can start. First of all, thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to the presentation and the book launch of Philodem Geschichte der Akademie by Fleischer. It's a real pleasure and an honor to present to you today this volume, which is an outstanding and monumental work, and which starts our new Brill book series, Papyri, Graecae, Herculanenses, edited by Professor Ranocchia, whom I thank for organizing this event. The book series, Papyri, Graecae, Herculanenses, will publish text editions with introduction and commentary of ancient Greek philosophy texts, which have been exclusively transmitted by the Herculaneum Papyri. The editions will benefit from the most recent advancements in the application of non-invasive techniques and the innovative papyrological reading criteria. The volumes will include transcriptions, facsimiles, and images of all textual sources, and the authors will be able to choose between a standard format like this one and the larger format for bigger images. Brill is very proud to be able, as a publisher, to present to scholars, researchers, and students these new editions, which will be instrumental in advancing scholarship in both papyrology and ancient philosophy. I would therefore like to thank Professor Ranocchia for making all this possible, for doing this with us. I would also like to thank the board members and the ERC-funded project, the Greek Philosophical Schools. The first volume of the series, which is already a milestone and will become a reference for future scholarship, is Philodemus' History of the Academy by Fleischer. First of all, I would like to congratulate Dr. Fleischer on the publication, and also to thank him for his hard work and also for a smooth collaboration throughout the whole production and publication process. His work and dedication have been truly outstanding, so thank you. And so Philodemus Index Academicorum, preserved in one of the most important papyri from Herculaneum, has been reread and re-edited by the author on the basis of innovative papyrological criteria and pioneering imaging techniques, which were unimaginable just a few years ago. The book presents new texts, improved and very different from former editions. It reveals new facts and sheds new light on the history of Plato's Academy. The edition and commentary provide new insight into ancient philosophy, biography, literature, and the ancient process of writing a book. This edition will become, at the same time, a model and a starting point for future scholarship. I will just stop here with this very short introduction to give the floor to the specialists. So the first, I think, is Professor Tiziano Dorandi.
Posso cominciare?
Sì, prego.
Prego. Che ore sono? Sì, d'accordo. È una mezz'ora che abbiamo di tempo per la presentazione. Perfetto. Sì. Allora, quando alcuni mesi fa mi fu chiesto di presentare questo volume, ho dovuto riflettere un po' prima di dare una risposta, perché pur essendo io l'ultimo editore di questo testo, gli anni che sono passati tra la mia edizione, che risale al 1991, a oggi, sono tali e tanti, sono più di 30, e quindi ormai sono un po' lontano da queste tematiche. Nello stesso tempo mi sono anche progressivamente allontanato dagli studi di papirologia per consacrarmi a studi più strettamente filologici, cioè l'edizione di testi a tradizione medievale. E la papirologia, l'ho sempre detto, è stato per me, lo ripeto, un errore di giovinezza, però la mia vera passione, il mio vero interesse è per l'edizione di questi testi di tradizione medievale, ai quali cerco di consacrare ora le ultime forze. Poi alla fine ho ritenuto che era mio dovere dire qualcosa su quest'ultima monumentale edizione, e che ha impegnato il suo autore per oltre, diciamo, 10 anni. Se voi prendete la bibliografia alla fine di questo immenso volume, vedete che il primo articolo pubblicato da Fleischer risale al 2014, cioè siamo ormai a 10 anni, ma quella è la data di stampa, e qui è l'articolo, Kilian aveva cominciato a lavorare sicuramente molto avanti, alcuni un po' di tempo in avanti. La lista degli articoli che Kilian Fleischer ha dedicato a questo testo è immensa, e quindi questo rende conto che è la persona più adatta a presentare, a portare a termine questa nuova edizione, e la lettura di tutti i suoi contributi preliminari in anni passati, di volta in volta, cioè ogni volta che l'articolo usciva, io l'ho sempre letto con attenzione e con vero interesse, mi ha facilitato nel compito attuale di fronte a questa enorme opera di sintesi e in questa vastissima opera che supera le 1000 pagine, e la cui lettura è stata cioè non è stata semplice, soprattutto perché per motivi che non dovuti a l'arrivo del volume, e per me è stato molto tardi, l'ho potuto avere tra le mani soltanto lunedì scorso nel pomeriggio, perché questo volume stranamente aveva fatto il giro dell'Europa prima di arrivare a casa mia. Comunque, avendo già presente il soggetto, avendo già letto la bibliografia sull'argomento dell'autore, la lettura mi è stata molto più semplice. Va detto fino da ora che questo volume consente un progresso enorme, e sarebbe inutile entrare nei dettagli rispetto a tutte le edizioni precedenti, e che questo progresso enorme è dovuto, ma non solo, ai nuovi mezzi tecnici che sono di cui può giovarsi oggi l'editore dei testi di Ercolano. Mezzi che all'epoca in cui io e tutte le persone che hanno lavorato precedentemente sui papiri di Ercolano fino a qualche diciamo grosso modo un decennio or sono, non ci si immaginava nemmeno che potessero esistere. Quello che alla mia epoca, con tutta la buona volontà, era quello era un pezzo di papiro nero illeggibile, e sembrava che non ci fosse scritto niente. Oggigiorno è diventato leggibile grazie a tutti questi nuovi mezzi tecnici, al progredire delle fotografie multispettrali e a raggi infrarossi. Non entro in merito a queste questioni perché io non ne ho una grossa conoscenza, però posso, facendo un confronto fra le fotografie che sono state pubblicate in questo volume del papiro con una presa di vista normale, cioè e con i nuovi sistemi, si vede a colpo d'occhio che l'editore può giovarsi oggi di mezzi che gli consentono una lettura molto più facile, molto più spedita, e quindi può, mentre in un passato molte volte ci trovavamo di fronte a, come vi ho detto, a carbone, quasi disperato. E viene qui in mente il famoso epigramma che Hermann Husener mise a introduzione dei suoi Epicurea, rivolgendosi a Franz Büchler, suo collega a Bonn, dove lui esalta gli studi di Büchler sui papiri di Ercolano: aurum Herculanensi qui cis carbone parare pisonis comitis quidare dicta facis. Quello che era carbone è diventato, come diceva Usener, se si può parafrasare Usener, oro, e quindi questo è già un ottimo, un punto di partenza eccellente e una garanzia nello stesso tempo delle qualità che ci possiamo aspettare da questo nuovo lavoro. Ovviamente la tecnica da sola non serve, e accanto alla tecnica ci vuole anche la scienza filologica, e qui mi sia permesso di ricordare di leggere alcune righe di un articolo di Wolfgang Schmidt. Era un articolo pubblicato nel 1955, poi in tedesco, riproposto poi in seguito anche in lingua italiana, dove Wolfgang Schmidt prende le difese del Diels nei confronti di certe critiche che erano state rivolte alla sua edizione del De Dis da Wilhelm Krönert, e scrive: tuttavia non bisogna dimenticare l'enorme dottrina linguistica e di contenuti posseduta dal Diels, e gli domina le teorie della teologia illuministica epicurea con sovrana perizia, quasi fosse egli stesso un adepto del Chepos. Ne va esagerato e via di sé. Questo per dirvi che cosa? Che anche il Diels pubblicò l'edizione del De Diels esclusivamente sui disegni, eppure fece un capolavoro di edizione. In qualche punto sicuramente è evidente che rileggendo il papiro con i nuovi mezzi i progressi saranno enormi, però la grande cultura filologica e la grande conoscenza della lingua e della filosofia epicurea di Hermann Diels gli permisero di spezzare, come dice lo stesso Wolfgang Schmidt, come lo chiama, come dice, gli dà un nome particolare, insomma, questa specie di maledizione che avrebbe potuto essere presente per chi avesse lavorato esclusivamente sui papiri di Ercolano. Quindi questa edizione, già in un primo aspetto, è un'edizione in cui la parte l'aiuto dei nuovi mezzi tecnici è stato apportato, è stato confortato è stato confortato dalle conoscenze linguistiche della lingua e della produzione letteraria di Philodemo e della sua opera del nuovo editore. L'Index Academicorum ha avuto una storia edotica abbastanza limitata. La prima edizione, a parte quella che è la riproduzione dei disegni napoletani nella Collezione Altera e piccoli interventi successivi, fu quella pubblicata appunto da Franz Büchler nel 1869 come programma dell'Università di Greifswald. Venne pochi anni dopo uscì a Berlino nel 1902 l'edizione di Meckler, e poi per più di 80 anni, a parte minimi interventi, alcuni interventi puntuali, alcuni dei quali io penso all'articolo di Wilhelm Krönert pubblicato subito dopo l'edizione di Meckler nel 1903, venne quasi abbandonato. Gli studi ripresero negli anni '80, verso la metà degli anni '80, quando Konrad Geiser aveva progettato un'opera monumentale sulla tradizione platonica, della quale purtroppo uscì soltanto il primo volume nel 1980, con una edizione della prima metà, grosso modo, dell'opera di Philodem sull'Accademia. Geiser si era io avevo già cominciato a lavorare alla mia edizione, quindi ci fu tra noi due un lunghissimo scambio di messaggi, come si faceva all'epoca. Non esisteva ancora la posta elettronica, ma esisteva la vera posta, quindi Geiser mi scriveva, io dovevo andare all'officina, leggere il papiro, rispondere a tutte le sue questioni. Quindi questa edizione uscì nel 1988, più o meno in concomitanza con la sua prematura scomparsa. Venne poi la mia edizione del 1991, uscita appunto a Napoli, e questa fino ad oggi è rimasta l'edizione di riferimento, migliorata nel frattempo con una serie di contributi in gran parte dovuti al nostro editore, e oggi è finalmente rimpiazzata da questo suo enorme, eccellente volume. Se si potesse applicare un'equazione a questa edizione, io direi che l'edizione di Bucher sta a quella che se si volesse, diciamo equazione, se si volesse fare un confronto tra l'edizione di Fleischer, mia, di Geiser e mia, diciamo, perché poi avevamo lavorato molto insieme, e l'edizione di Fleischer, c'è quasi, io direi quasi, la stessa, l'equivalenza, come se mettessimo a confronto l'edizione di Bucher e l'edizione di Fleischer. Sono passati 30 anni. 30 anni sono moltissimi negli studi papirologici, ma i progressi della scienza e soprattutto della tecnica hanno portato hanno portato a fare dei progressi tali che non ci saremmo mai aspettati 30 anni fa, ecco, diciamo. E quindi io sono il primo che parlo, forse mi è stato chiesto di parlare per primo, sia perché ero l'ultimo editore di questo testo, sia perché sono tra i presenti l'unico tra le persone che parlano, l'unico con una formazione originaria di papirologo, e quindi io vorrei richiamare, cioè farebbero alcune considerazioni, prima di ordine generale e poi di ordine particolare. Allora, di ordine generale, questa non è né una critica all'editore né ancora meno una critica all'edizione. Io trovo che non solo questa edizione, ma la più parte o tutte le edizioni per tutte le edizioni dei papiri di Herculano, io credo si debba riflettere ancora, e questo per me diventa sempre di più una priorità, sull'uso dei segni diacritici. Presentare i testi come vengono presentati, con tutti questi segni diacritici che abbiamo, che leggiamo, mezze parentesi quadre in alto, mezze parentesi quadre in basso, lettere puntate, lettere asteriscate e via di seguito, rendono estremamente faticosa la lettura di un testo come questo, quindi io mi domando se in un futuro, ma questo non sono io l'editore della collana, non si potrebbe applicare dei criteri simili a quelli delle collezioni pubblicate ad Oxford del progetto Philodemo, dove accanto al testo in colonna con i segni critici si mette poi in basso anche un testo continuo privo di questi segni critici che renderebbero la lettura esclusivamente più semplice per un lettore. In un'opera come questa, se voi prendete le ultime pagine, la parte finale del volume dove viene presentato la trascrizione viene presentata la trascrizione diplomatica del papiro, accompagnato da un apparato papirologico estremamente dettagliato di una grandissima utilità. Non dico che non avrei messo certi segni critici, ma forse li avrei anche ridotto. Questo è semplicemente come posso dire, un invito a tutte le persone, e sono tante che si occupano della storia dell'edizione dei papiri di Herculano, di riflettere ancora sul problema dei segni critici. In passato a un certo momento era venuto fuori questo problema, poi è stato un po' abbandonato, ma deve essere ripreso esclusivamente perché si rischia che un lettore che non ha un'esperienza papirologica si trovi spesso, o se non disorientato, ma un po' in difficoltà nel leggere questo testo greco interrotto, che non è spesso facile, come questo, interrotto continuamente da una serie di punti di segni critici di tutte le forme. Per quanto riguarda la Constitutio Textus, per quello che io ho potuto leggere, mi sembra che sia di ottima qualità e soprattutto credo che l'editore è riuscito a diciamo così a non cadere nella trappola di quello che io definisco il paradosso di Giorgio Pasquali relativo ai papiri di Herculano. Giorgio Pasquali, in una pagina, non mi ricordo più dove, non ho avuto tempo di recuperarla, ma lo dice chiaramente, ricorda che dice, non si sa se lo dice con convinzione o se lo dice col suo solito stile o modo di presentare le cose, dice: i papiri di Herculano sono in uno stato di conservazione talmente cattivo che prima bisognerebbe capire che cosa, perché per leggerli prima bisogna capire che cosa l'autore, cioè Philodemo, diciamo, ha voluto dire, e poi si riuscirà a leggere il testo del papiro. Ora, una cosa come questa è pericolosissima, perché si rischia di mettersi un'idea in testa e di ritrovare poi nel papiro quello che noi pensiamo che ci sia scritto, ma che in realtà non c'è scritto. A quello che io ho potuto verificare così en passant, riguardando il contributo delle fotografie, le ultime fotografie, cioè quelle a raggi multispettrali, a raggi infrarossi, mi sembra che non ci siano, che il testo sia stato ricostruito in maniera assai fedele rispetto alle tracce. Ma dico questo perché di recente a un convegno parigino su un'opera conservata in un palinsesto, invece il paradosso di Pasquali è apparso in tutta la sua bellezza, nel senso che molte volte gli editori di questo testo hanno creduto si sono fatto un'idea di quello che doveva il testo contenere e poi invece non hanno fatto altro che ricostruire quello che loro credevano di leggere nel papiro. Le novità dell'edizione rispetto, già io prendo come punto di confronto l'edizione di Geiser e la mia edizione, sono infinite e non posso evidentemente entrare in merito. Posso soltanto citare alcune di quelle che mi hanno più colpito, come quella famosa, quella sulla successione del nome del successore di Carneade, una volta si chiamava Carneade il Vecchio, ma di Carneade di Cirene, il cui nome è stato infine scoperto. E altrettanto importante, anche se su questa non si è messa, a mio avviso, si è poco insistito, ma è una scoperta veramente fondamentale per la storia dell'Accademia, è quella d'avere scoperto, anche se purtroppo il nome del personaggio rimane disgraziatamente in lacuna, il nome del successore di Filone di Larissa, o Filione come comunque si voglia chiamare, nella colonna 34 a pagina 232 dell'edizione. Questa scoperta è di fondamentale importanza per gli storici dell'Accademia, perché, se io ho ben visto, mi sembra che non sia stato finora messo in evidenza, consentirà di riprendere una vexatissima questione che aveva che è cominciata alla fine degli anni 70, cioè della posizione di Antioco di Ascalona all'interno dell'Accademia. Se Filone ha avuto un successore, questo significa in pratica che l'Accademia continua ancora per qualche anno, prima di chiudersi definitivamente, come tutte le scuole filosofiche alla fine, grosso modo, nel primo secolo avanti Cristo, con questo successore di Filone, e che consente altresì di dire che probabilmente Antioco non divenne mai lo scolarca dell'Accademia vera e propria, il che comporta, e questa situazione diventa sempre più evidente, la presenza ad Atene, all'interno delle singole scuole filosofiche, accanto a quella che noi possiamo chiamare la scuola ufficiale, di altre scuole che professavano la stessa dottrina, ma non avevano il monopolio, diciamo, dell'insegnamento della dottrina professata in questa scuola. Un altro aspetto, un altro punto questa volta dell'introduzione, su cui mi fa piacere, vorrei ritornare un secondo, è quello dei rapporti tra Filodemo e Diogene Laerzio. Io non ho mai creduto, e quindi sono perfettamente d'accordo con il nostro editore, che Diogene Laerzio abbia avuto davanti a sé l'Index Academicorum di Filodemo, il testo di Filodemo sull'Accademia. Per me questo era un dato di fatto scontato, a partire da certe mie idee personali che ho sulla produzione letteraria di Filodemo, cioè che nemmeno opere come la storia dell'Accademia abbiano mai circolato in maniera come vere e proprie edizioni. Quindi una volta che la biblioteca di Ercolano è stata sepolta dall'eruzione del Vesuvio nell'autunno del 79 d.C., queste opere sono scomparse per sempre, e se non fossero stati ritrovati i papiri, nessuno avrebbe saputo né chi era Filodemo né che cosa avesse scritto. A parte questo, il nostro Kilian ha cercato di provare, e di trovare una prova concreta, e questa prova concreta l'ha trovata alla fine della colonna 36, cioè nelle ultime parole, nelle ultime frasi con cui Filodemo chiude la sua trattazione sull'Accademia, e là dove quando presenta, dice, fa un passaggio: fin qui ho trattato della storia dell'Accademia, nei libri successivi della mia opera, quindi la Syntax Christon Philosophum, questa opera in almeno 10 libri che Filodemo avrebbe scritto come una storia delle scuole della filosofia, filosofiche greche, dice di passare a trattare delle scuole socratiche, quindi di Euclide di Megara, di Fedone e inoltre di Antistene, quindi del cinismo. Ora, questo è stato interpretato come prova per dire Filodemo non può essere all'origine, diciamo, non può avere Diogene Laerzio non può avere avuto Filodemo come modello nella storia dell'Accademia, perché in Filodemo le scuole socratiche vengono prima di Platone, e i cinici vengono dopo. Se non che è sfuggito finora a tutti un passo di Diogene Laerzio, cioè 2,65, siamo agli inizi della vita di Aristippo, dove io vi leggo il testo in traduzione italiana. Diogene Laerzio dice: anche Teodoro nell'opera sulle scuole filosofiche trattò Aristippo male, e Platone nel dialogo dell'anima, cioè nel Fedone, come abbiamo detto altrove. E questo, come abbiamo detto altrove, in greco viene en allois eirecamen, tutti danno questi manoscritti, il che vuol dire che deve essere interpretato che in almeno a un certo momento, voi sapete che le vite di Diogene Laerzio non hanno mai avuto l'ultima mano, sono state pubblicate postume a partire dalle carte di Diogene Laerzio. A un certo momento è possibile che la vita di Platone non occupasse il terzo libro come le occupa attualmente nei manoscritti, ma fosse precedente, e quindi precedesse il secondo libro, che è dedicato alle scuole socratiche. E vi dico questo perché questa difficoltà come posso dire, fu intuita da Markovic, il quale però col suo modo di fare assai spigliato, visto che nei manoscritti la vita di Platone veniva dopo la vita dei socratici, corresse la forma del perfetto eirecamen nella forma del futuro eiresetai, come diremo altrove, cioè nel terzo libro. E ovviamente questo non ha senso. È il momento che io debba di concludere questa neanche non una presentazione, ma una serie di considerazioni che ho fatto e che mi sono state stimolate dalla lettura di questo volume, con un giudizio d'insieme. È un ricchissimo volume dove c'è un'enorme quantità di materiale. Forse si potrebbe dire, se c'è un peccato è piuttosto per eccesso che per difetto, il che non è male, il che fa di questo volume come un'opera che è destinata, più che a una lettura continua, ad una consultazione, questa continua, o una consultazione, a uno studio di volta in volta per vari aspetti. Questo è inutile, che non ho insistito di dire, è un testo estremamente importante anche per la storia della pubblicazione del libro nell'antichità, per i metodi di composizione delle opere letterarie, perché è l'unico brogliaccio che noi conserviamo di un'opera della letteratura greca o latina, e quindi lo studio della struttura di questo testo può essere estremamente utile a chi, non solo per gli storici della filosofia, per gli storici della bibliografia, e sentiremo quelle persone che vengono dopo di me che metteranno meglio in evidenza e studieranno e presenteranno meglio di me questi aspetti, come un documento per la storia dei metodi di lavoro degli autori antichi. Per chiudere, visto che la mia terra di adozione o di origine, devo pure fare un'allusione a un grande autore della letteratura, vorrei fare un'allusione a un grande autore della letteratura francese. Questo libro, nonostante l'enorme, le 1100 pagine che riunisce, nonostante la quantità enorme di materiale che metterà più di una persona a rude prova nella lettura, non è un libro. È un libro che apporta moltissimo alla storia dell'Accademia antica, e quindi per una volta, come scrisse, si potrà a questo libro certo non potrà essere applicata la famosa frase, la famosa osservazione di Voltaire: les secrets d'ennuyé et celui de tout dire. Concludo appunto quindi con un ringraziamento sincero all'autore per per questo enorme lavoro, per tutti gli anni che ha consacrato a questo testo, nella piena consapevolezza che la scienza è la scienza, come tutti i tipi di scienza, e quindi anche la scienza filologica, è una scienza in continuo progresso, che ci sono che ogni produzione, come un'edizione come ad esempio questa, è un mattone per la ricostruzione della storia della cultura antica, e noi dobbiamo essere di nuovo estremamente riconoscenti all'autore, facendogli tutti gli auguri per il nuovo progetto che, a quanto ho sentito dire, porterà sul rotolo gemello di questo di Philodem, della storia dell'Accademia, cioè la storia della Stoa, che aspettiamo, o meglio io stesso aspetto, anche perché di questo sono stato l'ultimo editore, con grande impazienza. Che cosa dire per concludere se non ad maiora? Grazie per l'attenzione.
Grazie professor Dorandi, grazie mille. Lasciamo la discussione e una risposta magari da dottor Fleischer alla fase finale. So we will leave the final discussion at the end. And now I will leave the floor to Professor Stefan Schorn from the Catholic University of Leuven.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Graziano Ranocchia for inviting me to this book presentation and for giving me the possibility to read and evaluate Kilian Fleischer's Opus Magnum. When I first heard and then read in the book that Kilian's edition contains 30% more or improved text compared to earlier editions, I was impressed, but I could hardly believe it. After reading his new text and working myself through the voluminous commentary, I was even more impressed by the very high quality of his work. And I'd like to congratulate Kilian on this outstanding piece of scholarship. He has really improved the text a lot, and he has, in his commentary, drawn the necessary conclusions from his new text and has proposed many new interpretations. Of course, not everybody will accept also new readings, but I found many of them extremely convincing, and also their interpretation in the commentary. To be honest, I'm not a specialist in Herculaneum papyrology. I'm an editor and commentator of biographical and historical fragments. So I will focalize today on some, actually only a few, of the many new insights we get from Kilian's edition and commentary for our knowledge of Hellenistic biographical literature. And I will also say a few words about his commentary in general. The notes I've taken would allow me to speak for a long time, so be sure Kilian's book contains many more important insights than I can present now. And please be assured that the few points of disagreements I will talk about will be overrepresented in my short intervention compared to the many points where he convinced me. So let me repeat how much I admire his great work and erudition. As you all probably know, the version of the Index Academicorum in the Papyri 1691 and 1021 is basically a collection of excerpts from earlier Hellenistic authors. Philodemus' draft, not the final version of his History of the Academy. This collection transmits us important and sometimes long fragments of lost Hellenistic works. Of Dicaearchus, perhaps stemming from his work on ways of life, of Philochorus Attis, Timaeus' Sicilian history, Neanthes of Cyzicus' Lives of Famous Men, Hermippus of Smyrna's on those who went over from philosophy to generalship and power, Antigonus of Charistos' Lives of the Philosophers, Apollodorus' Chronicle, and other works. What makes these fragments so valuable, besides their often unique character, is that they seem to be closer to the lost originals than fragments transmitted by Diogenes Laertius or Plutarch, because the latter two authors have usually reworked them to fit their own literary agenda. This closeness to the original text is something that also Kilian often and rightly emphasizes, and that he documents in detail in his commentary. But let me start with a few general methodological remarks on the commentary and the edition. Not counting the long introduction and the last part of the book titled Varia und Fallstudien, the commentary comprises almost 500 pages, which I would call a full commentary. It's split up into three parts: Einordnung, Quellen, Kommentar. The Einordnung section contains a full discussion of the biographical, historical, and philosophical information in the various thematic sections of the index. Here, Kilian discusses different possibilities of interpretation of what Philodemus wrote or may have written. The text is often lacunose, and he contextualizes the information of the index within the whole of the ancient tradition on the same topic. He shows that he has an excellent knowledge of the ancient tradition and of modern scholarly literature. It's a welcome feature of the commentary that he usually does not discuss anymore old readings of the Greek texts and old interpretations that have become obsolete by his new text, and that he always says explicitly where his text has new readings and thus new information. This part of the commentary is a major contribution to our knowledge of the lost authors excerpted by Philodemus, and to our knowledge of the biographies of the philosophers described there. Despite its length, the commentary isn't overloaded and it has a clear structure, so I found it easy to read. The second section discusses the sources of Philodemus, and the third one, the papyrological minutiae, that will be less interesting for the general user of the edition. First, I wasn't very happy that I had to look up the discussion of each single thematic section of the index in 3 places of the book. And I would have preferred a single commentary on, let's say, the list of Plato's disciples in columns 5 and 6 that consists of 3 parts: a general interpretation, discussion of the sources, and the papyrological details. And then the same with the chapter on Plato's death and so on. But when I later read the whole section on the sources of Philodemus, I was happy and content that I didn't have to scroll many times and could read everything in one single chapter. So I see the advantages and disadvantages of the different possibilities to structure the commentary, and I think that Kilian's decision for his tripartite commentary is perfectly fine. I also agree with his decision not to insert the columns on the verso into the text of the rector in the places where they probably belonged. Although Kilian has made much progress in locating the positions where on the verso Philodemos wanted to insert these texts, I agree with him that in many cases the intended position is still too uncertain, so it was consequent to print all columns on the verso together in a separate section of the edition. But now let's come to some of the important new insights about Hellenistic biography that Kilian's book has to offer. I will start with a section taken from Neanthes of Cyzicus, who is of special interest to me because I studied this author in the past. The most interesting part of the excerpt from Neanthes is a chapter on Plato's sale as a slave on Aegina, which Neanthes narrates with reference to an oral authority, a certain Philiskos of Aegina. Kilian rightly names these lines, I quote, perhaps most enigmatic ones of the whole papyrus, end of quote. As for the constitution of the text, he has made significant progress, but it still remains a mystery to him and to me what exactly the T Macedonicon was, something Macedonian, that Plato was afraid of as a slave on Aegina. But it constitutes an essential step forward that Kilian has seen that the episode is dated here much earlier than in the rest of the parallel tradition, namely to 405 or 399, and not to 387, and that there is no link to Plato's journey to Sicily and his visit to Dionysius I, and that he is sold not alone but together with others. This is important because what we read in Neanthes is our earliest version of the story, and Kilian may be right in concluding that the link of Plato's sale as a slave with his trip to Sicily may be a secondary development of the story. What I still find very strange in Philiskos' story is that it presupposes Plato to be famous. The poor man who bought him didn't realize who he was. This doesn't sound like he didn't know he was a young man of noble birth, but it sounds like he didn't know he bought a famous philosopher, which Plato was not yet in 405 or 399. My impression is that the illogical and incomprehensible statements of the story, especially Plato's presumed fame and his fear of something Macedonian, might be anachronistic elements that are due to Neanthes' source Philiskos. We know that Philiskos was a cynic philosopher, and I can imagine that he modified the story in a way that could present Plato in a less positive light. But this is, of course, not much more than guesswork. A second point on Neanthes. Kilian's new text of an addition to column 5 shows that Neanthes isn't quoted there, and that fragment number 23 in Jacobi's collection is to be deleted. This also means that Neanthes didn't present an account of Plato's death, which was different from that in Speusippos, as I and others had assumed on the basis of earlier editions. And also Kilian's discussion of Neanthes' date is very important. Here I'd like to stress that Kilian generally includes short chapters on Philodemos' source authors in which he summarizes the facts the reader needs to know about them, their date, tendency, and general characteristics, and where he sometimes, as in the case of Neanthes, contributes to the general knowledge of the fragmentary author. I was glad to see that Kilian agrees with my date of Neanthes' birth around 360-350. But he makes it very likely that the Delphic archon Heracleidas in an honorary inscription for our man, our Neanthes, is not the archon of 274, but an earlier homonymous archon who can be dated between 315 and 280. To be honest, I had never been very happy with the very old age we have to assume for Neanthes if he was honored in 274. And Kilian's new interpretation now allows for a more plausible, shorter lifespan of this author. I would even say that now a somewhat earlier date of birth is possible, but not necessary. I'm a bit less convinced by Kilian's idea that also the list of Plato's students may stem from Neanthes. The absence of Philip of Opus in this list is, as Kilian rightly notes, remarkable, and his idea that he is lacking because Neanthes had just presented him as Plato's collaborator in the story of Plato's death is very tempting. But my impression is that the character of the list speaks against Neanthes as a source. As Kilian himself rightly notes, the list often adds some small, short characterizing elements to the names of the students. For example, that they were tyrant slayers. That similar additions can be found in other lists of students in the Index Academicorum, but also in the Index Stoicorum. And that these characterizations go back to Philodemus' sources and not to Philodemus himself. I totally agree with these insights. So my impression is that all or most lists of students in the Index Academicorum stem from the same source, which then cannot be Neanthes for chronological reasons. Here and elsewhere, I have the impression that these lists are usually foreign bodies in the chapters on the philosophers and don't go back to the main authors summarized there by Philodemus. But I again totally agree with Kilian that the specifically positive remarks on Plato's students point to an academic or pro-academic source, which incidentally is another argument against Neanthes because there is no evidence that he was an academic philosopher or particularly philo-academic. So much about Neanthes. I was very glad when I read this wonderful chapter. In the section of the index based on the peripatetic Dicæarchus, which deals with the life of Plato, the number of Kilian's new reading seems to be a bit lower compared to other sections, probably because their most recent editor, Gert-Jan Verhasselt, was already able to make use of multispectral images for his edition in Fragmente der griechischen Historiker Part 4. But even here, there are some very interesting new readings and interpretations. The most important insight for the study of Hellenistic biography I find in Kilian's discussion of column B, which stems from Papyrus 1691. Only a few years ago, Gianluca Del Mastro discovered that this text is part of the first section of the Index Academicorum and probably goes back to Dicæarchus. In column B, we read about philosophers before Plato who didn't leave writings. Then we read in a very fragmentary passage the words on nature and perhaps on political things, but that's the last reading is uncertain. These readings were seen in the past as a reference to the 3 Pythagorean books Plato was said to have bought, titled On Education, on Politics, and on Nature, the so-called Tripartitum. If Dicæarchus spoke of Plato's purchase of these 3 books, this would considerably change the general reconstruction of the development of the legend of Plato as a buyer of Pythagorean books. It's generally assumed that the original form of the story was that Plato only bought 1 book, namely Philolaeus on nature, and that the 3 books represent a later stage of the legend, because this version presupposes that he not only took his natural philosophy from the Pythagoreans, but also his ethics and political philosophy. And this interpretation would collapse if already Dicæarchus spoke of 3 books, and it would also have a serious impact on the chronology of the pseudo-Pythagorean Tripartitum and, as a consequence, other pseudo-Pythagorean works. However, Kilian has made it very probable that Dicæarchus only spoke of 1 book on nature, or that he compared Plato's interests to those of earlier philosophers. So in all likelihood, there was no mention of the 3 books here. I come to the chapter from Hermippus. An excellent example of Kilian's ability to reconstruct the text can be found in an excerpt from the biographer Hermippus, and deals with Chiron of Pellene, who was, quote, an academic, wrestler, soldier, and tyrant. Here Kilian puzzled together, as he says himself, the readable text on the papyrus, the hyperspectral images, the decenni, and Papyrus 164, the definite version of the history of the Academy, and, what was decisive, he recognized a doublet in columns 11 and 12. All this enabled him to convincingly reconstruct these columns and, among other things, to identify the title of a so far unknown speech of Hypereides, to restore the correct title of Hermippus' work, and to read the name of a new war, the Hyperasian War, named after the Achaean city of Hyperasia, later known as Aegera. I finally come to Antigonus of Charistus as a last biographer whose fragments have benefited from Kilian's work. His edition of the columns based on Antigonus contain a very, very high number of new readings and interpretations. As most of you probably know, the biographies of Polemon, Grantor, Arcesilaus, and Lacydes in this section show significant overlap with those in Diogenes Laertius. The main question since Wilamowitz' groundbreaking book of 1881 is, which elements in Diogenes go back to Antigonus, and which are later additions? In general, the presence of an element in both Philodemus and Diogenes proves provenance from Antigonus. So it's of extreme importance that Kilian has identified many new pieces of information in the papyrus, which then enabled him to claim more text in Diogenes for Antigonus. But his most important contribution regards the biography of Arcesilaus. Basing himself on bibliological calculations, he has shown that between column 19 and column 20, 5 columns of text have been lost. This makes it possible that Diogenes Laertius also used Antigonus in 11 more chapters of his work, in chapter 33 to 43 in book 4, as had already been hypothesized by Wilamowitz long ago, but Wilamowitz couldn't prove it. He didn't have any proof. That Wilamowitz was right is made extremely likely by Kilian's meticulous study of the topics and language of this passage, and by pointing to significant overlap of content between column 19 and chapter 33 in Diogenes. I only disagree with Kilian's interpretation in one major or not so major point that I would like to discuss with him later on. While Geiser thought that Philodemus used all the authors quoted in the index directly, you, Kilian, share Wilamowitz's view that he used some late diadochai tone philosophon in which most of the earlier sources were already cited. I'd like to ask you to reconsider this, because I think there are some good reasons to assume direct use of most sources. This can, for example, be seen in the excerpts concerning Plato. If an author who wants to write a life of Plato, such as Philodemus, makes excerpts from an earlier life of Plato, the excerpts likely follow the structure of the earlier life. So one would expect an excerpt that starts with birth and provenance, then deals with various events of the life, has thematic sections, and closes with information on the death. In a second step, or already as a first step, depends on the author, the future author would order the excerpts according to topics in the way he intended to present them in his new biography. References to earlier sources quoted in the older biography would in both cases be found in different sections of the excerpt. But in the index, excerpts from one and the same author usually stand together as one continuous text. The excerpts from Leontes start with information on Plato's name, which would stand in a biography at the beginning. Then follows the story of Plato's sale as a slave in perhaps 399, and then the account of his death in 347. These three elements would be read in three different parts of the source biography. I cannot see any good reason why Philodemus would go through a life of Plato and collect and put together all interesting references to Leontes. That's what a modern collector of fragments would do, but not an ancient author who wants to write a biography of Plato. The same may be said about the excerpts from Philochorus that precede those of Leontes, where we first read about a bust of Socrates and then about Plato's grave and date of death. A second argument for direct use is that many lives are based, or likely based, as you have shown very convincingly, on one source only if it disregards the lists of students. For Speusippus, this is only Philochorus. For Xenocrates, Philochorus, and one edition from Timaeus. The lives of Polemon and Grantor go back only, and the lives of Arcesilaus and Lacytus almost only to Antigonus. Why should Philodemus have excerpted only these references from a diadochai that must have included quotations from other sources, and especially many passages where no authority was mentioned? The latter is almost lacking in the index. That is very strange. Third, a diadochai would have contained a life of Heraclitus Ponticus. But as you conclude yourself, and correctly I think, the chapter on him was added at a later stage and is an excerpt from Demochares' work Against the Philosophers. Again, a very strange source. Fourth, this work by Demochares and Hermippus' book on those who went over from philosophy to generalship and power were used directly by Philodemus, as you argue as well. But these were rare works in the 1st century BC. If Philodemus had access to them, he may easily have had access to Leontes, Philochorus, Antigonus, and so on. Fifth and last, you often and rightly stress that Philodemus' excerpts are usually literal excerpts or come close to the original wording. That would be unlikely if they were quoted by an intermediary source, because authors usually reformulated their sources and adapted them to their own style and agenda. I know that Philodemus is an exception to this rule, as Papyrus 164 shows. But other historians and biographers, such as Diodorus, Plutarch, Porphyry, Jamblich, did reformulate their sources. The high quality of the excerpts would be difficult to account for if they were embedded into a later diadochai. So I think it's much more likely that Philodemus used most of his sources directly. He may have added some general information from one or more diadochai, but these diadochai were not the source through which he quoted the old authorities. There is only a slight possibility, I think, that a diadochai was his source, and now I contradict myself. Namely, if it was that of Alexander Polyhistor. We know that many of Alexander's ethnographical works only consisted of more or less literal excerpts from earlier ethnographical literature. If his diadochai ton Philosophon was of the same type, Philodemus may have found all the excerpts there. But it isn't very likely that it only consisted of excerpts, as Pietro Zaccaria has shown in his edition for Jacobi Continued. Another problem would be that Alexander seems to have quoted his authorities in indirect speech, so we would have to assume that Philodemus changed his back to direct speech. For all these reasons, direct use of most of the authors still seems to me the most likely scenario. If this is correct, this greatly increases the value of the text Philodemus has preserved. But let me conclude. The adjectives excellent and outstanding have almost become standard epithets in book presentations, but here they are really in place. In my view, Kilian's book is the most innovative and the most important contribution to Hellenistic philosophical biography of the last decades, and it has set the bar high for the volumes to follow in the new book series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Schorn. And now the floor to Professor David Sider.
So thank you very much, Julia. And good afternoon to everybody in Europe. And I don't see anyone here from North America, so I won't say good morning. It's my pleasure to have accepted Graziano Ranocchia's invitation to say a few words about the publication of a new edition of Philodemus's History of the Academy, itself just a part of his larger work on the history of philosophy. The PDF came not too long ago, and I received a copy of the book itself in its more welcome hardbound paper form only this past Monday. I thus find myself in the position of a young boy being invited by the owner into his candy store or sweet shop and given a short time to take whatever I want, but obviously not the time to take everything that's on offer, provided that I gave some account of what I had sampled. Here then is my brief account and appreciation of 1,000 pages, and if you want to know, 2.2 kilograms of scholarship, knowing that I have certainly missed a lot more. And also, of course, I will go with some of the same grounds that Tiziana Durandi and Stefan Sean have gone over. Okay, I began by doing what many scholars do when presented with a new book in a field to which they themselves have contributed, namely by checking to see how many times my own name appears. This part went well. Now to the table of contents, which immediately shows the uninitiated how much and how many skills are needed to produce a new edition of a Herculanean papyrus, a task of eponymously Herculean proportions that increasingly nowadays calls not only for autopsy of the old-fashioned sort, but knowledge of and familiarity with the most advanced technology to date, along with investigations into promising new technologies. And Tiziana Durandi has gone through some of the details and which are laid out by Killian himself of how much more he has done thanks to this new technology. Where once electronic microscopes were cutting edge, we now have multispectral imaging of opened pages as opposed to rolls still unopened. Where an unopened page, but where black ink, thanks to the electronic microscope, can be distinguished from black papyrus. The human eye sees only a blank page. I remember once Richard Janko holding up production of one of his Philodemus books. It was already in press in order to take advantage of this brand new technique at the very last minute. Richard was also very instrumental in modernizing the reading and editing of Philodemus texts. He, for example, realized that the fixed curvature of single sheets can be measured to give some idea of where the text might have stood relative to the end of the roll. I encourage you to turn to page 62 of Killian's book to get an idea, a beautiful illustration in a book that itself comes with incredible illustrations of sorry, there we go, where the colors mean something different and the length means something. It's I congratulate Brill on taking on such a major task of book production. So after centuries of damage to one extent or another to the rolls in an attempt to open them still unrolled, those that are still unrolled, and I myself in my book on the library and others have reported on the damage that was done, it was sensibly decided not to continue with the practice of unrolling. If rolls are to be read, it will have to be thanks to techniques that are, to borrow a phrase from internal medicine, non-invasive. The goal now being able somehow to read without unrolling. Killian himself, in his recent book, De Papyri Herculaneums in Digitalen Zeitalter, has now provided a brief introduction, but an excellent one, to the several promising new techniques that are now available, such as hyperspectral and shortwave infrared imaging and X-ray fluorescent mapping. All the techniques were developed at great cost, not for scholarship, but for astronomers and medical scientists, but which can now be tweaked to help the more impoverished science of papyrology. Thus, multispectral imaging, developed by astronomers to distinguish distant and dim objects in the sky from their surrounding, black on black. There's also now hyperspectral imaging, developed by the military. This is to detect flat camouflage soldiers at night, but it can now be used for more beneficent purposes in medicine, as well as now for the more benign scholarly purposes of reading what Epicurus and Philodemus and some others have to say about their own philosophical beliefs, which are often, to our further benefit, once we can read the text, then contrasted with the beliefs of others to an extent denied to all the fine scholars who began to read the Herculaneum papyri, first with their eyes alone, until these microscopes and other techniques began to be developed. And so, I mean, as we know, every time we read more Philodemus, we learn not only about Philodemus and Epicureanism, but also about, typically in a work of Philodemus, the opponents. And so, for example, the whole field of Hellenistic literary theoretical criticism, it was largely unknown to us before Philodemus came in order to argue against him. To continue with a little bit on the technology, a grant from the American National Endowment for the Humanities that helped fund the purchase of electron microscopes for the papyri collection in Naples, as I said, that was only the beginning. Some of the newest techniques I can understand only in the broadest terms. X-ray fluorescence mapping, for example, can detect embedded iron atoms, which differ from ink to papyrus. All of this, Kilian Fleischer has taken advantage of and is thus able to advance upon preceding work. Progress has been slow but sure in the reading of an unrolled papyri, which is what I've been talking about. I mean, of unrolled papyri, but we all live in hope someday, not too far off, of penetrating the rolls without any further unrolling. A ruinous process that cannot help but lose precious letters and words, as scholars seek a process similar in overall nature to computer-assisted tomography, some of us which have had personal experience in the hospitals. For this, we look to Brent Seals in the United States and to others in Switzerland, whose progress has been, as I say, slow but steady, as their machines and computers work to visually flatten out and distinguish not the two-dimensional pixels, the pictorial cells of a normal image, but the mountainous, rugged voxels, three-dimensional volumetric cells that resulted when the hot gases of Mount Vesuvius turned every drop of moisture in Herculaneum into a larger volume of steam that deformed the interiors of every papyrus roll. So I will not say anything, I think, to this audience of Philodemus himself. You all know his role as it was discovered in the 18th century and later. But in the book at hand, more specifically, we have Kilian Fleischer's re-edition of a portion of Philodemus of Gadara's History of Philosophy, a magnificent work of scholarship that deserves the admiration of all. He has thoroughly mastered all the necessary philological and technical skills required to deal with an ancient work that appears in fragments only on charred papyri and drawings made by 18th century draftsmen, the disegnatori, who of necessity often had to destroy their original in order to get to the papyrus layer that was stuck below. In addition, so that the disegni in Oxford and in Naples now become primary witnesses to the text. In addition to the excitement of recovering the 18th century new text from antiquity, there was the additional thrill in the discovery of the Herculaneum papyri of knowing that now extant were books that had been handled by the author himself. Now, furthermore, Kilian can convincingly argue that one of the texts of the work he is editing shows clear sign of Philodemus's own handwriting. The long sought for Manos Philodemi, the first work from antiquity, graffiti aside, where the author's own handwriting is extant. This in itself is a wonderful thing. We can and do refer to this book loosely as a history of philosophy, but it's more accurately a history of philosophers. And maybe the word history too is in need of modification, since Philodemus's Greek title seems to be Syntaxis ton Philosophon, the possible meaning of whose first word, syntaxis, Philion discusses. It is an odd title, syntaxis, an arrangement, an ordering, an array. It seems to fall somewhat between the two stools of more familiar terms, peridiadochon and perihaireseon. The word peridiadochon deals with a succession from one person to another, not necessarily even a historic passing of leadership, as Euripides can speak of a diadoche of Erinyes, furies who seem to come in waves. This is an odd usage. Perhaps Euripides somewhat maliciously, if not amusingly, comparing the furies to the succession of Athenian magistrates who had their own diadochai. When applied to philosophers, though, it may first have been applied merely to the succession of ideas, but it soon enough came to be more limited to the succession within schools. We may see, excuse me for a second. So we're talking about the term diadochai and how it may have changed and solidified. We may have seen an early instance of this usage when Plato lumps the East Greek Xenophanes with the Eleatic ethnos. And this is from the Sophist. He refers to Eleatikon ethnos apoxenophanus tekai epiprosten arxamenon. The Eleatic tribe, beginning with Xenophanes and even earlier. So without using this word, he seems to be grouping philosophers by beliefs rather than by geography. And then Aristotle, however loosely, puts those people we now call pre-Socratics under the rubric of protoi philosophesantes, protoi philosophoi, which seems to include all of his predecessors but Plato and perhaps Socrates. But Aristotle does so loosely, even if he refers to Thales as ha tes toyautes archegos philosophias, the chief, the leader, the archegos of such a philosophy, a kind of philosophy. Aristotle's term is entirely one of chronology, though, and not hierarchy. So we may see what we could have guessed, that when it comes to philosophers, a succession within a single school of thought entails the evolution of ideas in this grouping, even if there is no formal school. But by the 4th century, every thinker seems to have belonged or was thought to belong to one school or other. Even the cranky loner Diogenes of Sinope came to be considered the founder of the Cynic school. This is a headmaster whom Charles Dickens would have loved to portray. But Diogenes, of course, would never have thought of himself as that. The other name for historical counter philosophers, perihaireseon, also exists. That is, but similarly, by beliefs or by sects of philosophical schools. Philodemus, however, is credited by Diogenes Laertius with at least 10 books. We assume that he means 10 himself, but his language allows for more. At least 10 books of a Syntaxis ton Philosophon, an unusual title, as I've said, but which is not found in the Papyri, but which, as Philion shows, should not be rejected as that chosen by Philodemus. It may have been his. Now, Graziano Ranocchia has recently read a Herculanean papyrus concerning Eleatics and Atomists that confirms Philodemus as author of a little bit of on perhaps Eleatics and Adamus, but which also cast doubt on the word syntaxis, since the frayed letters of the colophon, the subscriptio, seems to refer to its title not as syntaxis, but perhaps, as he suggested, exetasmos, or as Gert-Jan Verhasselt now reads in the first issue of the equally welcome Philosophical Papyri Journal, more likely the word in the subscription is merely a mention of Democritus, which in turn suggests that the traditional view that this comes from a section of the work on Eleatics as well as Adamus may be wrong, based as it is on the one-word xenophonies in the papyrus. In any case, other Philodemian fragments from other rolls may reasonably be assigned to this large work, not simply what Killian has edited, whatever its title. But going back to this one fragment, it would be nice if it were Eleatics and Adamus together. I myself would like to see what Philodemus might have to say about Parmenides and other pre-Socratics, hoping to find always more direct quotations, however unlikely this is, especially since I've come to the conclusion that the text of Parmenides in particular was quite rare, rarer than even Simplicius suggests. It was never quoted by Epicurus, who was stingy in any case with acknowledgments to predecessors, and it was almost certainly unavailable to Philodemus once he left Athens. I note that Parmenides, quite naturally, this is not a criticism, is not mentioned even once in Killian's book, but that's an aside. This fragment, this book of Philodemus on both Eleatics and Adamus, however, it may have been consulted by Cicero, who in his Academica often alludes to both these schools of thoughts in the same context. Now, back to the meaning of the title Syntaxis ton Philosophon. I spent now concentrating on the word philosophon, which nowadays equivalent books would be not of philosophers, but of philosophy. So this is an arrangement, not of philosophical schools as literally, but an arrangement or whatever of philosophers. But since the complete work seems to have categorized philosophers by diadochai and haireses, perhaps Philodemus's title should be considered an abbreviated version. So something like Syntaxis ton philosophon diadochon takai hairesion, that is, an arrangement of philosophers by school and sect. So then, what Dr. Fleischer has given us here can understandably be considered the largest selection of fragments devoted to a single school of philosophers, and that, as had long been assumed, it is part of a larger work on all philosophers. It's all but confirmed by his new reading of the very end of this book that he edited, where Philodemus looks forward. This is Killian's own contribution to this vexed fragmentary text, where Philodemus looks forward to its discussion of how Platonism was continued by Euclid, Phaedo, and Antisthenes, as well as more generally, further, as he himself says, the Diadochai and Haireses. What, though, was Philodemus's idea of a syntaxis ton philosophon? It is not the sort of historical survey that we find in Aristotle and Theophrastus, such as we see in Book 1 of Aristotle's Physics and of Aristotle's Metaphysics, where it is each philosopher's ideas that are surveyed, each one critiqued serially as Aristotle proceeds, a manner of philosophical survey followed by Philodemus himself in his more philosophical works. Here, however, he kind of mixes them together, but the principle's the same. Here, however, Philodemus tells us more about philosophers themselves and their confrontations with one another. We even learn that Plato became feverish at one point, that he was so named because of his broad forehead, that he was buried near the Academy, and so forth. And Stephen Shawn has talked also about some other anecdotes about Plato. The syntax is, in other words, quite biographical and anecdotal, reminiscent, in fact, of another work on philosophers in 10 books. And this is confirmed by Diogenes Laertius, who notes that Philodemus characterized Poloinus as a just and a kindly man, epiekes kai philikos, something I don't think Aristotle would bother telling us. And that Polemon of Oia was the son of Philostratus. That's good enough for Aristotle. But Philodemus goes on to describe him as a leading citizen of Athens, which Aristotle would not mention. So this is not how Theophrastus writes in De Sensibus, where pre-Socratics are grouped now one way and now another, according only to the views they may share on the various senses, hearing, sight, and so on. Lactantius tells us in the Institutiones that, like Philodemus, and I kind of quote here, but paraphrase a little bit, Arcesilaus, the head of the academy, gathered together philosophers who, that is, in writing, gathered them together, philosophers who criticized each other and the confession of ignorance made by distinguished philosophers, and he prepared himself to argue against them all. So there's a tradition of gathering together predecessors and arguing against them. In laying out the text of the syntaxis, Kilian assiduously identifies Philodemus' source wherever possible, and Stefan went through this in detail. Sorry, to go back. This is largely of the kind of biographical accounts of individuals which began to be written in the 4th century and which, as Kilian says, crystallized in the 2nd century. And Stefan, shown as alluded to by Kilian, says in a book that I have not seen, Stefan, I'm sorry to say, refers to as Sammelbiografien. But I'm not sure what he means by this, so perhaps Stefan could speak to this later. Dr. Fleischer, Kilian lists all of the known Diadochai, but these could well have been partly philosophical in form. The only possible model suggested, again, Kilian adopts from Stefan, is a certain Hippobotos of the 2nd century BC, who, among other things, tells us that a veiled statue of Empedocles that had been erected in Agrigento was later moved to Rome. In fact, of great interest to me. This is indeed the best model one can find for Hippobotos wrote a Perihairesion, in which Diogenes Laertius tells us he divided philosophers into 9 haireses pai agogas. None of them, so he lists all of them, none of them are pre-Socratics, that is physphusakoi, and some of them rather obscure. For he talks about the Anacarian school, totally unknown to me. I have no idea what that was. But could Hippobotos have been Philodemus' source not only for biographical anecdotes, but also for the very form of his whole work? He has cited Hippobotos often enough in our extant text to make him at least a partial model. But this leads to another question that I'll leave for Kilian to answer if he wishes, namely, why would Philodemus have chosen to spend so much time on such a work, which contrasts so markedly from the bulk of his writings, where he is not interested in amusing anecdotes, but rather a scrupulous examination of the many minute ways in which his interpretation of Epicurus differs from others, including often enough other Epicureans, such as those on Rhodes. I leave the question open then and conclude my remarks. But again, congratulations, Kilian, for what's a marvelous monument to scholarship.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Seider. And now Professor Harold Tarrant.
Thank you very much, Julia. Est quidam Kilian, homo humanus et non solum philosophia, sed etiam cateris studiis, quae feri cateros negligere dicunt. I quote back at you the beginning of your preface. Only the names have been changed to protect the innocent. Let us begin then with congratulations to Kilian on bringing this grand project in which he's been involved for several years to completion and producing something that revisits a text in the light of readings only possible thanks to modern science, much of which Kilian has explained here or had a hand in explaining previously. Those congratulations need to be extended to Graziano, without whose entrepreneurial flair and papyrological skills all the various techniques might never have come together to produce a volume like this in the first place. They also need to be extended to Julia and to Brill for their willingness not only to publish this magnificent volume, but also to take on a series that hopefully will see a selection of the most important Herculanean texts receive new treatment, new exposure, and new interest in the ancient philosophy community. Inevitably, I think, I have to look at the volume more from the point of view of an end user. Since 38 years exile in darkest Australia has separated me from the centres of serious studies in philosophical papyri, and my eye health is no longer good enough for me to retrain in the arts of autopsia, I fear, or to work out with any certainty where the ink lies in the less legible parts of the multispectral images. But from 1981 until 2018, I have been interested in this man from Larissa, who I knew as Philo, but I now, like a good opsimathess, have learnt to call Filio, thanks to Kilian's work already published. And I know something about this man's death too, and even perhaps about his successor, Achaean, I believe, though I would have a slightly different interpretation of what the Achaean might be from that of Kilian. Working on Philo, one couldn't avoid working also on Charmidas, of whom and of whose pupils we also now know something more from column 23, his provenance, through columns 31 and 32, his teaching in the Ptolemaion, to columns 35 to 36. More recently, I've had to re-examine Crantor and his relationship with Archesilaus, more or less by accident. And in this particular area, Philodemus is needed for an understanding of the value of Diogenes' account, and also of Speusippus, whose dedicatory inscription has been clarified in column 6 and is now the subject of a special study here on pages 949 through to 57 in this grand magnum opus. Hence, there's no way that I can avoid being deeply interested in this new study and what consequences it might have, even though I must confess I haven't digested anything like all of those consequences myself as yet. Philodemus is less used for the direct clarification of ancient philosophy than for the understanding of the people themselves. I suppose that befits a syntaxis philosophon. For the people themselves, but also what they wrote and how this was received by others, the tales that were told about the writings. This tends to be what I'm most interested in this text, and for that it's vital to be to be able that is vital to be able to have legible instances of words for books or for notes of various kinds in the text. For instance, Diogenes Laertius 424 speaks of Crantor as leaving 30,000 lines of hypomneamata, and it is naturally of great interest to know what that might have meant in the context of Antigonos and the history of the Academy. For me, it's vital to be able to consult the index of Greek works like this, and it has been rewarding to use the index of Kilian here, as one could used to be able to use the index in Durandi, of course, but not quite such a full index as we've got here, thanks to new material. And to be able to compare other passages with the passage that one's particularly interested in. Column 16, on which I've spent far too much time for virtually no results myself, almost certainly doesn't use the word hypomneamata here, but on the other hand, column 18 does use that word for whatever it was that was left by Crantor to Arcesilaus, and that latter column, that latter thinker, that's Arcesilaus, had worked on before either publishing this stuff or burning it. The term hypomneamata had been missing from the equivalent passage there in Diogenes Laertius 432. Looking at the two authors together, the first thing that one is struck by is the fact that the talk of the 30,000 lines follows immediately after talk of Crantor's studies with Xenocrates and Polemo. For that reason, I think it's most likely that it should speak of something that takes up issues raised during one's studies. I think it must refer to a limited category of works, since a lifetime output of 30,000 lines would not exactly be evidence of philoponia ascribed in Kilian's final version here to Crantor in column 16. After all, a total of 43,475 lines were ascribed to Speusippus and 224,239 lines to Xenocrates. They really believed in giving you exact numbers at times. Presumably, these figures were arrived at as a result of the copying process, whereby a copyist would be paid by the line and leave marginal numbers, such as Janko has recently discovered in the Derveni papyrus. The figure for Crantor is nowhere near as precise, proving that the total could not have been due to special philoponia on the copyist part. And it may also be I think a proverbial figure, since Gregory of Nazianzus is said to have composed 30,000 lines of syntagmata, and it's probable that Damascius, I think, said that Asclepiades had composed a prose work of no less than 30,000 lines. So 30,000 lines may have had some special significance, since adding the lines of the Iliad and Odyssey to those of the Homeric hymns, one arrives at a total of plus or minus 30,127. So maybe it's a general figure illustrating Crantor's Philoponia. But I think in any case, it must have applied to a certain part of his output, not previously published, but left to Arcesilaus in case it was of any value to others after his death. What survived had presumably been copied and left to a scribe to total up, which would adequately explain the kind of text that Kilian actually leaves us at 1612 to 13, which at first sight seemed to me rather an unnatural, perhaps roundabout way of expressing a total word count, but it might instead be an ordinary language for a particular kind of scribal procedure when they added up the lines that they had copied. Diligent student compilations would fit. This doesn't, it would fit the circumstances of hyponemata here. This doesn't, I think, make Crantor a grammaticos in the sense of the noun, of course, but it does make him grammaticos in the natural sense of the word. For that reason, if I'm permitted a tiny indulgence, I would like to propose that Kilian's Dioscoros Grammaticos at 1610 to 11, which I can certainly live with, might possibly have read rather Kurios Grammaticos, giving the more precise sense that I want. But I realize that this is a pretty self-indulgent suggestion. I'm especially glad in the case of Crantor that we have his answer to the question of where he wanted to be buried. Not because we now understand it a little better, but rather because this illustrates Crantor's ability, even at the end of his life, to come out with the appropriate tragic line, just as when he had once seduced Arcesilaus away from the clutches of Theophrastus at the beginning of their relationship. So you have questions, you have these marvelous quotations from tragedy at the beginning and the end of Crantor's relationship with Arcesilaus, it seems. The Fleischer index then allows one to look also at column B, 10 to 13. And here the very ancient philosophers neither left behind nor circulated hypomnemata like he, presumably Plato, did. Leaving something behind, that is the verb katalepein, recalls what Crantor is supposed to have left for Arcesilaus in column 18, so that the alternative would naturally be publication. But presumably we are here talking about Plato, who might have published some things immediately and left some sketches to his successors. We do not normally associate Plato with hypomnemata, but then Xenophon's account of Socratic discussions are known as the apomnemonumata, so that it's not so hard to think of the livelier Socratic works of Plato as a genre intended to bring alive the memory of what conversations the chap one was learning philosophy from really had. Plato's works were not always seen through quite the same spectacles as we see him, and I think the glimpses of how Plato's works were seen in Philodemus are really quite valuable. It's for this reason that I've puzzled over the beginning of column 1, trying to work out what it was that Dicæarchus thought Plato had given new impetus to, by adding eurythmia to it and by adding novelties of his own. I think the contrast between whatever was received from earlier and what was being added is clear enough, but it remains unclear to me whether the earlier ingredient was generic or stylistic or more philosophic and technical, as the reconstruction techneid would suggest in line 2. It is in these first 6 lines of the column, though, that I'm personally torn between what weight I'm supposed to be given to new readings and to those of the Oxford Disegno in particular. Of course, the disegni of the recto need to be consulted now in Geyser, because we're not only treated to the verso in the new plates at the end of Fleischer. I can't criticize the volume for not being any longer here, so that is not a criticism. And we've also got those invaluable plates of the new readings at the end of Fleischer, which are great, but which are probably much more easily consulted by someone like me in the ebook version, when can be blown up on screen, than they are with a magnifying glass at the end of the book, I'm afraid. Okay. It worries me that the Oxford people seem so much more certain of themselves in line 4 than in line 2, for example, whereas the new edition involves actually rejecting the evidence of this Disegno 3 times in the first 9 letters, without very much to read in the papyrus in its present state, as far as I can work out. It seems more or less accepted that the en-ton of the Disegno cannot be right. But if we're dealing with stylistic matters here, as suggested perhaps by the reference to eurythmia, could we not read some part of entonos, which is a perfectly good Platonic word, meaning something like highly strung, perhaps, in English, and it's actually applied to the rhetorical lifestyle in Theaetetus 173a. Or perhaps couldn't one read entonia? I don't know, I can't offer very much here, but I've become rather suspicious of the entois logos reconstruction, perhaps with no real justification, though perhaps one could say that pros elaben would seem to require a simple dative to go with it, which could just be the relative hois at the end of entois logos, if only any tor or pi or kappa preceding the omicron had been aspirated. But of course, the aspirates do not fit in the same way there. I raise this here not because one can settle on any better reading, but rather as an illustration of one of the most important background problems for the end user like myself. What weight to give various forms of evidence involved in the complicated process of determining the final text printed, and whether that weighting remains the same throughout the whole task, or whether one should vary these weightings in accordance with the special problems of the individual passages. And that's perhaps a question that I would like to ask of Kilian there. But I have rather little more to say. there is this question of whether one's better off using the print or electronic versions. I have to say that I'm not particularly skilled at using ebooks, and it might be a lot easier than I think it is to switch from the final version to the diplomatic version of the text, for example, and then to the plates and so on back again. But I would find it much easier myself to be able to insert a bookmark at the columns that I'm interested in at the moment in the plates, and also in the diplomatic version when I'm and also in the very fine and balanced commentary, then so that I can refer easily between the four things that I'm going to be consulted frequently when dealing with one particular column. And it is likely, I think, that as this sort of end user, I'll be dealing with it sort of one column or two columns at a time, rather than as a whole text, even though this is a text with an enormous amount of interest to it, because of the special circumstances, not just the author's own hand, but the illustration of the way that the author went about his authorial tasks. I think it offers so much enlightenment in that area. So although I've had to be very selective in what passages I've tried to tackle in any detail here, but rest assured, in spite of all my little worries, I found Kilian's commentary on the particular passages I was looking at fair and balanced, and indeed not free of the kind of worry that people like me have about various lines. He does not believe that he's cleared up all the difficulties, that's for certain. Whatever else I may say, my primary reaction to this splendid volume is bewilderment at the sheer scale of the resources that has been placed in our hands by a single volume. And the second reaction is a matter of feeling so privileged to have been allowed to be participating in such a launch as this in such distinguished company. So thank you, Kilian, for all you've done for us.
Thank you very much, Professor Tarrant. And now we will open up the discussion with the author. I think first, Professor Ranocchia would like to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you. I am not involved myself in this discussion because I am not the editor nor the author of this huge volume. But I would like to thank all the speakers and yourself, Julia, for all the support, for participating, first of all, in this wonderful presentation, and to Brill, publisher, and yourself for producing such a marvelous book from all points of view, very accurate from both a redactional and a bibliological point of view, in a different sense than papyrology implies. And so this is a good sign for future publishing, or for future book publishing in the footsteps of tradition. So tradition has not yet died. This is important for us because we come from other times of history, as you know, as classicists and as lovers of the ancient world. And at this point, in this regard, I would like to say something about this long preparation or incubation of this marvelous edition by Kilian Fleischer. I can testify myself how deeply and how intensively the editorial work on Philodemus Index Academicorum has been on Kilian Fleischer's part, because I had the privilege to be associated with this editorial work for many years. sometimes every day, for many days, weeks and months subsequently, uninterruptedly, Kilian Fleischer and myself have explored the text after Kilian had made a complete personal and manual transcription of the whole papyrus through microscope reading. This is why I would like to highlight the philological part of this work with respect to the technological one. It is not true that only technological advances in the reading of this papyri through several advanced techniques has been the only or the main merit of this new edition, but the main merit of the new edition has been the incredible philological efforts and competence of Dr. Kilian Fleischer in constituting the text, as has been said already by Tiziano Randi at the beginning of this presentation. In this case, I was admired how emendatio and divinatio, how competently, and how intensively and appropriately were applied to the textual constitution of this papyrus. So the philological part of the papyrus is possibly the most important to my judgment, but I am not going to present the book myself, so sorry for this. I will add just a very few words on the rationale of this new series. The new series has born not to substitute older renowned series, of course, because the latter will go ahead in the future, as I hope, but because there was a need to introduce new editorial criteria, which are only partly testified in this new edition by Kilian Fleischer. Since more than 1 decade, Holger Essler and myself have developed a new system of editorial criteria for the edition of Herculanean papyri, which is more or less the same, but I presume to have improved in some way in the last years, which has been systematically adopted by my research group in the last 10 years, and which is being to be adopted now in Philosophical Papyri, the new journal, and also, of course, in Papyri, Graecae, Herculanenses. But Kilian Fleischer's new edition was born many years ago, when this process was still ongoing. When this process was still working on, and has gone ahead with this continuing using this criteria, because it was not possible to change them abruptly or during the work. So the criteria, the editorial criteria used by Kilian for the Constitutio Textus are very innovative, as you have seen, because there are diplomatic transcription, paleographic apparatus, a real critical apparatus, which is not historical but critical, as has been remarked by previous speakers. But the diplomatic transcript is not yet directly associated with the literary one on facing pages, but it will be the case in the next future for the next editions in the Papyri, Graecae, Herculanenses. This will allow getting rid of all these diacritical signs, which may be found now in the literary transcript, but which should be found only in the diplomatic one. So the Greek text in the literary transcript will be more readable, much more readable than it is the case now. Nobody is guilty for this state of things, because Herculanists perfectly know that currently there is like an editorial jungle, a jungle, like an anecdotal jungle. Everybody uses the system which he or she wants. There are 3 different series which use different systems. There is also, of course, the Collection Budet and the marvelous editions by Daniel Delattre, which also use their own criteria. So there are too many differences in editing papyri. This is not good. And I associate my voice to that, to Tiziano Dorandi's one, and agree with him about concerning this remark. So the direction, the ratio of Papyri Graecae Herculanenses is also this one, to encourage people editing Herculanean papyri using the same editorial criteria, which must be the most rational and the most coherent possible, and also the most papyrologically acceptable possible. This is what I wanted to say, but I leave the floor to the author and the other participants.
Yes, so let's open the discussion, and I think Dr. Fleischer can start by replying to the comments of the presenters.
Yes. First of all, I would also like to thank you, Julia, Brill, and the editor Graziano for making this possible. In particular, also for supplying financial support to launch this series. I have to admit, I almost feel a bit uncomfortable after all these laudaciones almost. But there was also some criticism or some points for discussion, and I would like to address them. Starting with Professor Tiziano Dorandi. I think within the last 10 years, there was barely a day where I didn't recall or somehow mention your name, because I was obviously working with your edition, with your suggestions, also with some brilliant comments of you. And I think your main point was, and this is really a crucial thing, readability of my edition, in particular if it comes to non-experts, readability, let's say for philosophers, historians, classicists in general, and versus diacritical science. And there was, I would say, maybe a kind of trade-off. The problem was we have here this particular draft version of Philodem with columns which are very high, and I had to make a decision how to connotate the papyrus with which science, and how to divide diplomatic transcript and literary transcript. So my idea was that it should be a mix of a proper papyrological approach, but on the other hand, I didn't want to blend for this special papyrus the diplomatic transcript with the literary transcript, so to speak, that it should be possible for everyone, also for non-experts, to read this edition more like a philological edition, let us say like an OCT text, more or less, without focusing on this papyrological aspects. So for this reason, I decided to put the whole literary transcript in the appendix, so that, let us say, the really interested people could consult it. But let us say the average classicist who is more interested in the text has a kind of readable text. You are completely right, Professor Dorandi. These diacritic signs, in particular these upper square brackets, are sometimes, let us say, in particular for people who are used to it, not very nice for reading. But on the other hand, I have also made this clear in my case studies. I thought it would be appropriate, maybe even necessary, to indicate also in this literary text in the proper edition where I have taken something from the disegno. This means that these letters are not in the papyrus anymore and could be theoretically wrong, or in which cases an alpha in the text really means that the alpha is still in the papyrus. As Professor Graziano has pointed out, you don't have this problem if you have the text side by side, but this was for several reasons not possible in this edition, because sometimes you have 2 pages of literary of diplomatic transcript, and this would have created a mess. But you are right. Also, what you said in general, papyrologist should think whether too much indication, too much geocritical science may at some point make a text very unpleasant to read for the general audience. Yeah, and so this was really a kind of a problem. This was also a bit related to the layout. We discussed in that very long how we should present this text. But I think we have now found, you may be right if you criticize it, I think we have, for this special text, found an appropriate mixture of these both aspects. Readability, like a normal philological edition, but at the same hand, some papyrological annotation. So thank you very much, Professor Durandi, for this very important note. You also mentioned the reading the Dexator in this column 34 of Antiochus. So in my opinion, it still stays possible that somewhere in these lines we have a kind of diadoche information, but where you have read the Diadexator, I think already David Plank and I have agreed, suggested Diagenitor. So it can't be in this line, but maybe it is in another line, but I'm not convinced that this information that Antiochus was a successor of Phileo is mentioned there. Next, I would like, if you have any other questions, you can raise it then. Otherwise, I would go to the comments of Professor Stefan Schorn. Yeah, so I have the impression that you have really made a kind of in-depth study of my book. So first of all, I'm very, very happy that you agree with this, let's not say redating, but with this new, let us say, possibility concerning the dating of Neantes. And as you said, for me, at least concerning the biography of Plato, this information is might be of incredible importance. It's our earliest witness, and obviously it seems that there is no Dionysius mentioned, so this whole slavery episode might be have taken place maybe at an earlier stage and has no relation to 387 or whatever date. Also, it's not mentioned in the seventh letter. There are some explanations, maybe he felt ashamed, whatever, but maybe an explanation might be that nothing happened in this year, and it's that Plato was sold in slavery earlier, namely at the end of the Peloponnesian War, which I think is the most likely date. And it's very interesting that you said maybe Philiscus at some point has blended something that he imagined that Plato was already very famous at this time, what might be wrong, and some other elements. But I mean, my point is, if there had already been at the time of Neantes a very famous and valid tradition that Plato was sold into slavery by Dionysius, why should have Neantes reported something like this referring to Philiscus? So also there we have these many Athenians which were sold into slavery, and this very much hints at the end of the Peloponnesian War. And we have also in these other sources, I think Diogenes, but also others, sometimes some references to laws there, and also to the Peloponnesian War. It's also on the back of the papyrus. The Peloponnesian War is mentioned in column Y in the context of this episode, and we might have here something. I mean, we think we were never able to figure out the details, but we might have here an indications that maybe, in fact, later on, this whole slavery episode, which might have been some real historical element core, that this was just later transferred or combined con the episode in Sicily con Dionysius the First. So thank you very much for this. Your other important question was basically you have a point there. So I don't think that Philodemus has more or less taken more or less copied an original Diadochai from some author. So if it comes to Demochares, we always have to keep in mind that Philodemus wrote 10 books, syntaxes. And so maybe if he had heard of this speech of Demochares against the philosophers, this would have also for other books a natural thing for him to consult the original of this book. The same might be true for Neantis' book and also for Hermippus. For Hermippus it's quite clear because Hermippus, this book is also quoted in the Index Stoicorum. If it comes to Timaios, I'm a bit skeptical. I can't imagine that Philodemus was prouding the whole Timaios for this academic reverence. It might be possible, but I would further suggest that he had maybe one or two Diadochai which he may have consulted earlier, and then he may have blended, he may have taken some quotations from this and some from the other work, because otherwise we would we have to assume that for the first time Philodemus has compiled a chronological order for the entire academy from himself, and this does not seem likely to me. So you are certainly right. So there are some works I think he had original access to, but although if it comes to Antigonos, I'm not too sure anymore. I guess he may have taken something from a kind of Diadochai work, I don't know which work, and then he may have combined this with original sources. But I mean, it's difficult to understand. The arguments you made, in particular in the life of Plato, that at least in this life he hasn't followed another original, another Diadochai source. These are very convincing for me, these arguments. So I would agree. But nevertheless, I think he, even if he had consulted some or even many original works, he may have at least excerpted some kind of original syntaxes from another author. Yes, so yeah, concerning the Neantis passage, this Archelaus is very interesting because he died in 399, and maybe there's something in Plato's early bibliography which was lost later and somehow, yeah, explains why Neantis has a story which is obviously not combined with Dionysius and takes place in Plato's early years. So if you have later questions, you may ask. I first want to go to the comments of David Snyder and Harold Tarrant.
I see that Professor Puglia has a question maybe related to this.
Yeah, so otherwise I would just very shortly comment on the other two talks, and then we can have a general discussion. Maybe this would be better. So yeah, Professor Snyder, I was very happy that you are also interested in, let us say, the mathematical, bibliometrical aspects of my work. I've seen on your curriculum vitae you also did a BA in mathematics, if this is correct. Okay, yeah, it's correct. So I did also some mathematical studies in my early years. So yeah, you mentioned one point which might be also evoke a lot of discussion or criticism. This is whether the so-called 10b, which I identified in the first 3 columns of the verso and in one marginal note, might even be the hand of Philodemus himself. So basically, the idea that ancient authors wrote at least very long texts is nowadays considered as improbable, and I agree. They had scribes for this. But in a kind of draft version like this, at some point, I can't imagine that Philodemus not has taken his stylus at some point and made some notes or even some brackets or for the transposition where he wanted to move a part one section to the other section or to add something. So at least I think that some of these critical signs, there are some bars, some horizontals, some brackets, say at least some of them should come from Philodemus. So I'm not talking about corrections of the proper text, but of layout matters or reductional signs. And yeah, so also because this is a cursive element, I think we shouldn't exclude that this might be even Philodemus' hand, which also would make me very happy. This would be, as I said, more or less the first ancient author from which we have for sure his own hand, so some also of some prominence. And yeah, as Professor Dorandi, you also mentioned the preview at the end of the book, which is quite interesting because it resembles the previews in the Diogenes Laertius. He has at many books, he makes this kind of previews to the next book. And your last question was, why has Philodemus, an Epicurean and Orthodox Epicurean, written a work like this? I have written some passages in my book. I had some thoughts on this, but it's. I mean, we know that Philodemus and his generation of Epicureans, they were very interested in philology, and maybe Philodemus wanted to have a kind of fact and data-based work in which he could consult if he were writing other philosophical works very quickly, which philosopher lived at which time. But on the other hand, at this time already there existed some other literature Philodemus could have used. And so I have no definitive answer why he has written this kind of work. I mean, we know that he was very interested in the history of Epicureanism. Also, he made a kind, with the so-called Pragmateia, a kind of ancient fragmented collection of passages in Epicurus' works. But I have no definitive answer how Philodemus, who wrote epigrams, was interested in philosophy, why he wrote this kind of work. I've uttered some speculations in my book, but I have no definitive convincing answer. So now I would like to come to Harold Terrance's comments. I remember we have discussed many times the Quanta column, and also we made some improvement. So I'm happy that you agree that Philo of Larissa, that his name was actually Philo of Larissa, which is confirmed also by many readings neglected so far in ancient manuscripts. Then your suggestion concerning eis epon logon is interesting, that it could be a kind of terminus technicus of the scribes of this area when it comes to counting lines. Then for a very long time, I think for 2 or 3 years, I had in my edition your suggestion of Socrates in the second line of column 1, which I think is brilliant, but unfortunately for paleographical reasons and for reasons of space in the papyrus, I couldn't put it in the text, not because it's not a good suggestion, but because it would have a certain impact or influence if I did so. And the traces, I mean, this is what are the requirements. And the space in the papyrus just didn't seem to match the word. So I was careful, but as you have maybe realized, I've discussed your very interesting suggestion. Also, this entois logos. I mean, on the other hand, we have this word. We have the logoi in the same column just a few lines later, in lines 14 to 15, and it was a common word for the, obviously used by the Kaiachos for the dialogues of Plato. So your entonos, I will think about this, but as if I remember it also. If I remember the traces correctly in the papyrus, it looks like entois logos, but I will have another check. Then I think you also mentioned this literary and diplomatic transcript. I know that for certain scholars, as you certainly are, you're very interested also in the polygraphical details, also for making your own suggestions. But I've already explained in my response to Tiziano Dobrandi's comment or criticism that at this particular papyrus it would have made the complete edition almost unreadable if I had done this, in this case, side by side, literary and diplomatic transcript. So I decided to put it at the end of my text. Yeah, and also we discussed the kiosks. I know your interesting comment on this in column 34. Well, I think there may be also some other comments or questions by participants. So I will restrict myself now to this for the answer of the four papers or the four talks, let us say. And if there are now other questions, I will take them now. Thank you.
Posso parlare?
Sì.
Sì. In realtà non ho una domanda da porre al nostro autore. Vorrei solo dire alcune parole in quanto indegnamente membro del comitato scientifico di questa nuova splendida collana. E allora innanzitutto le congratulazioni più vive e affettuose all'amico Kilian, che è l'autore, poi al direttore della collana, Graziano Ranocchia, e poi naturalmente alla casa editrice Brill, la quale ha stampato un volume di eccezionale bellezza e diciamo anche un volume difficile da stampare. È stata un'impresa e direi che è stata un'impresa ben riuscita. Vorrei poi ringraziare anche i relatori di questa bella presentazione e consentitemi un saluto particolare all'amico Tiziano Dorandi, col quale mi legano lunghi e felici anni di frequentazione dell'Officina dei Papyri Herculanesi di Napoli, quando non c'erano le fotografie naturalmente, o quelle che c'erano erano molto artigianali, diciamo così, quando si leggeva con i microscopi e ci voleva molta arte, diciamo così. Era un'altra epoca. Permettetemi anche di dire che sono felice di aver partecipato in qualche modo, in piccola parte, a questa bellissima impresa editoriale. E vorrei ricordare con affetto l'incontro con Kilian ad Escolano, un incontro avvenuto circa 10 anni fa, auspice sempre l'amico Graziano. E lui aveva 10 anni in meno, era ancora più giovane di quello che sia adesso. Io ero un poco meno anziano e ci fu subito una felice consonanza, insomma, un'intesa. Lui entusiasta, io molto felice perché avevo trovato uno studioso il quale era convinto, come me, che l'avevo detto tempo prima, che Filodemo fosse passato per Alessandria. Ora su questa affermazione basata su una lettura dell'Index Academicorum era calata la scure di una stroncatura, diciamo, per cui la cosa era impossibile. Basta, punto, non se ne doveva parlare. Kilian invece era convinto che Philodemo fosse stato ad Alessandria, come avevo avuto l'ardire di affermare. Da quel giorno abbiamo parlato spesso, ci siamo scambiati delle idee, abbiamo collaborato, a volte abbiamo anche, non voglio dire litigato, ma insomma discusso su alcuni punti del papiro. Oggi è un giorno bellissimo perché si arriva alla meta, si arriva al momento finale di questo lavoro lungo, complicato, difficile, però bellissimo, bellissimo, diciamo la verità. E quindi sono felice, gli rinnovo gli auguri e le congratulazioni. Naturalmente adesso aspettiamo il secondo atto, cioè l'indice degli storici. Grazie.
Grazie,
Sì,
professor Puglia.
Sì, non c'è una necessità di rispondere molto, ma anche come io ho ringraziato Graziano, come ho fatto anche nella mia preparazione latina, anche Enzo, tu sei stato da molto aiuti in questi anni e tu sai che io sono molto grato. Sì, come tu hai detto, oggi è un giorno molto felice per tutti noi. Sì, grazie.
I see a question from Jula Wilberger.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you very much also for this event, which has been a wonderful opportunity for me to learn basic news about this very interesting edition. And I'm curious. So you're now working on the Index Stoicorum, and when can we expect something new? And what are the kinds of issues that you think are interesting with regard to the Index Stoicorum? So maybe a little bit of a preview or a cliffhanger because I'm working more on the Stoics, but this is also super interesting for me. So just as much as you can tell.
Yes, of course. So I have, after my German habilitation, I've returned in March to Naples, and now I'm working full-time for at least altogether for 1 year, but maybe longer, in the Greek Schools project led by Professor Ranocchia. And this project is dedicated to a complete new edition of the Syntaxis Ton Philosophon, this work and 10 books of Philodemus, of which the Index Stoicorum is one part. To say it clearly, the Index Stoicorum is a second preserved text after the Index Academicorum. I would say the text amounts maybe to a third of the Index Academicorum, more or less. The upper 10 lines are preserved, and I have now not finished a transcription of the whole papyrus, but let's say now of 60–70% of the papyrus. And there are indeed some newer readings, of course, due to the state of preparation and other things. You can't compare it with the Index Academicorum, but there are also substantial new readings. So I've just submitted 2 articles in these days. And at the Index Stoicorum, you can't expect this huge amount of completely new information, but at various columns, as also Graziano Ranocchia has shown in an article 2 or 3 years ago on Ariston of Chios, there also some improvement is possible. It won't be, let us say, that spectacular at the Index Academicorum, but there might be some interesting new readings also concerning the question of sources, and some new names and some lists of pupils, but also some things with relevance for philosophy. So there will be a progress, which is maybe, of course, more modest than the progress with the Index Academicum, but there will be a lot of substantial progress. And I think it depends now on my future career, what happens within the next months or years, but I may finish it maybe within the next 3 years, but is ambitious within the next 2 or 3 years, but it is quite ambitious. So we will have to see. But so I'm optimistic that within the next 2, 3, 4 years, a new edition should appear. Obviously, depending on my other obligations I have in academia, but I think it might work. Yeah.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
I just curious because I also found it very interesting what you discussed about the use of sources for the Akademie. So is the general method of source use similar, you think, meaning using some kind of diadochizography in addition, and then maybe looking at particular individual texts?
Yeah, so there was the theory, and I cannot refuse the theory, but also, on the other hand, I can't confirm this theory. So within the next years, I have to find out whether the theory that Stratocles of Rhodos, a pupil of Panaitios, is really the major source for one part of the Index Stoicorum, or whether this citation has another meaning in this context. I have to work on this. But for instance, this work of Mimpus from those who converted philosophy to generalship and the exercise of power, this is quoted in the Index Academicorum and also in the Index Stoicorum, and it seems that it is quoted firsthand. And this seems, for his syntaxes, Philodemos has looked for some works which in this context make sense, philosophers who left philosophy, and then he used this for several books of his works, yes. So we can say this for certain, but concerning the other sources in the Index Stoicorum, it's difficult due to the state of preservation, but in particular, the Index Academicum is a draft version, and we have here really work in progress. We can see how Philodemos has copied and pasted some columns in the text, has made much more notes, and for these reasons, we are much clearer how which sources he used and how he structured this. And at the Index Stoicorum, some conclusions can be drawn, but not so many. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's super interesting. I will follow this closely.
Professor Ranocchia.
We can't hear you, Graziano.
Just a few words to those pronounced by Kilian about the pipeline of Papyri, Graecae, Herculanenses in the next year, so to speak. Gertian Verhasselt, Professor Verhasselt, is going to submit a new edition of Philodemus' History of Socrates and the Socratics, another important section of the syntaxes of the arrangement of philosophers. And Carlo Pernigotti is going to submit a new comprehensive edition of the so-called Index Epicureorum by Philodemus, which has discovered in reality to be a very peculiar collection of Epicurean testaments rather than a history of the Epicurean school. A unique text within the Herculanean collection, maybe the only documentary text of the Herculanean collection. So, and there are also other books in the pipeline, but I don't want now to take away, to solicit your curiosity. So.
Are there any other questions or comments? No?
I saw, Julia, that prominent colleagues have joined us during this presentation. I would like to thank them also in name of the other speakers and the scientific committee. And if they want to ask questions, they are very welcome, of course.
They can also write on in the chat, I think. Well, if there are no other questions, I would just like to thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, Kilian and Graziano.
Thank you to all the participants and in particular to the speakers. Thank you very much.
And thank
congratulations again. I see something in the chat. Yes. Some thanks. Okay. So thank you again and have a nice day and yeah, and a nice summer.
Yeah.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.